Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Carlos. I'm a web developer based in Brooklyn, New York, and today we're going to work on a project called Form a Story. Now, in order to complete this project, you should be familiar with HTML. We're going to be working with a certain boilerplate provided for us, but you should know how the structure works with HTML tags. You should know how to create HTML tags, be familiar with several of them, and you should also know how to add attributes to these tags. Lastly, you should know how to nest elements. We're going to be creating divs within other divs in our boilerplate HTML. So you should be familiar with how to do that. And lastly, you should know how to work with CSS and create classes for certain HTML tags that we're going to be creating. We're not going to be actually writing CSS, but we're going to be being provided some CSS and styling to our HTML. So in case you want to know how it works, you should be able to navigate to the file and understand how to create these classes and style all these elements. Okay, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, welcome to the Form a Story project. So at this point, you should be familiar with certain tags with HTML. Today, we're going to be experimenting with the form tag, and we're going to be grabbing user input for information grabbed that's stored in that form. And once a button is clicked, that information will be rendered in a different page that will be displaying a story that contains certain words that were submitted in that form. So there's some logic for parsing and inserting that user input, and that's already taken care of in our main.js file. So if we click on the folder icon, we can go ahead into that file and see how it's actually happening. Don't worry too much about this. We're going to be focusing mostly on the HTML, but if you're curious to look into the JavaScript, you have access to it right there. You also have access to the styling sheet, so you can see how our display is actually being styled and our certain elements are being styled as well. Feel free to mess around with it. If you want to change the styling, that's totally fine as well. So we're going to be creating a form and inserting certain information to it so that whenever we submit it, our JavaScript file knows to grab certain elements and then display them on the page again by creating a new story. So people will insert certain words, and this will work kind of like a matlib. Well, they will be asked for certain animals, adjectives, and verbs, and once we submit the form, those adjectives will be placed into placeholders from a story to create a story using the words you created from that form. Okay, let's go ahead and get rid of these JS and CSS files. And we'll go ahead and move on to the first step. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, since we're going to be collecting information from users using a form, we need to actually add a form tag under the HR tag element inside of the body. So you'll see here around line 17, right below line 17, we're going to be adding our form there. So let's go ahead and add an opening and closing tag for our form. And I'm going to actually create the closing tag in a new line because I know we're going to be nesting information inside that form. Okay, let's move on to step 2. Now we're going to assign the action attribute with the value of story HTML and another attribute called method with the value of get inside the form. So let's go ahead over here and we're adding the attribute action. We'll set that equal to story.html, and the action attribute simply specifies where to send the form data when the form is submitted. So let's add also our method, which will be a get method. Okay, so the method attribute that specifies how to send the form data. We can send it in different ways. We can use HTTP post transactions as well when we set that equal to a post attribute, post value to the method attribute. But for this one, we're actually going to send in a get request. And in case you didn't know, if you actually don't pass in the method as get, it will be default to get. Just in case you forget, it will always be a get by default. Okay, let's move on to step 3. Okay, in the form, we're going to create a submit button by adding an input with the type of submit, and then we're going to assign the value, a value of for my story. Then we're going to save our code and see our button being rendered in the page right here on the right. So right before our closing tag, right over here, let's go ahead and create an input tag. And just in case you know, input tags are self-closing, so we don't need a closing tag for that. Now we can actually type two attributes. Will be type. Whoops. Type will be submit. And we're also going to add a value of form my story. Scroll a little further down, actually make some space. There we go. Let's go ahead and save this. And you can see the actual button here being rendered on our page. Now for button elements, the type attribute just specifies the type of button that we're going to create. There's a few different types we can actually submit, and we're going to be working with a couple of other ones. But in this case, we're actually just going to submit this whole form. So when we click this button, we're going to be submitting this whole form. Whereas the value attribute here, the value is basically, it specifies the value of an input element, and it has a different kind of behavior for certain different elements. But for elements like button or reset and submit, it just defines the text on the button itself. So whatever we write here will be displayed inside the button. Now, if we actually go ahead and submit this form, we haven't really filled out anything in the form, but if we go ahead and submit it, we can see exactly what will be actually rendered after we grab the information from the form. So all these null values here, these are basically input elements that were not filled in, that were submitted with the form. So if we actually hover over them, we can see that it was looking for an element that had an ID of animal 1. Over here it had the same ID. There's certain different ones that actually had different IDs that we're looking for. So when we submit a form, we're going to be looking for input elements that have that ID and also a name. So you can't really submit a form without a name, whereas if you submit it without a name, it would actually not be able to know what actually wants to grab from it. So this will make more sense once we start filling out the rest of our form. But I just wanted to give you a quick little tip that you can actually start submitting the form without having the whole form completed, just to see what's not being rendered, what's missing. You might have actually named an ID or name at an input element wrong. Maybe you named animal 1 without a dash and therefore it's coming out as null. But if you have an input element with a name correctly as animal 1 and an ID for an animal 1, then it should be able to display whatever you put in that input element right here on our story. Okay, let's go back into the main actual page, and let's move on to step 4. Oh, let me go right here. Okay, so now we can populate our form with input elements that allow users to type in their responses, and we're going to also want to have associated labels with this input so users know what they're filling in. So let's go ahead and add in a label element and assign the for attribute a value of animal 1. And let's also have our label render a text that says animal with a colon. Okay, so let's go ahead and type that right after our opening tag for the form. Remember, we want our type, our input here for the button to be all the way at the bottom, basically indicating the user that before you submit it, the whole form, you have to fill out everything inside it. So all the input elements that we're going to be creating. So our label tag will have an opening and a closing tag. And the purpose of the label tag is simply used to add it's just to add a label to the form control, like a text or anything. So when we want to actually render text, and we're going to specify what the label is for, and this will be for the first animal. And the for attribute that specifies which form element a label is bound to. So in this case, it will be for specifically the animal 1. Let's save that and make sure it actually renders it in our, okay, there we go. Okay, let's move on to step number 5. So now that we can create an input to associate our label with, we're going to do that right under our label, and we're going to set the ID to animal 1. We're going to set the type to text, and the name will also be to animal 1. And we got to remember that the name attribute is needed for the information. So without the name attribute, we will get a null if it actually has no name found in the submission form. So let's go ahead and start by creating our input element here. I'm going to make some space. Remember that it's self-closing, so we don't need to add another closing tag. Let's add the ID of animal 1. We'll also add the name of animal 1. And we'll type in the type as text. We'll go over these attributes in a second. So the important attribute here would be mostly the name element. The ID in this case is used to associate the input with the label, but you can optionally use it for styling if you want to as well. And we want to specify what kind of information we're putting in the input. The data type here is text. But for the name, we're actually using the name attribute to reference elements in a JavaScript or to reference form data after a form is submitted. So when the form is submitted, it will look into what the name of the content within this input that has a name animal 1. And that way we'll be able to render it and look for it and actually display it on our page. Last thing we're going to add is simply a required attribute, and we don't need to assign it to anything. We can simply type in required. And that is basically a Boolean attribute. So when it's present, it specifies that an input field must be filled out before submitting the form. In some browsers, you might actually even be shown that a little warning if you don't fill it out, and it won't let you submit it. So let's go ahead and save that and test it out. Okay, you see we have a little input here. We have our label tag. And if you actually submit it without it, we see that our required attribute comes into use, and it doesn't let us submit it without it. So let's type in an animal here, and let's submit the story and see what we get in the story. Okay, you see that we actually grabbed the value of that input element with the ID of animal1, and it looks for this input element itself. But let's say I go back and I actually mistype the name, and let's go ahead and start over. Let me actually refresh this as well and save it. And if I type tiger, it will look for this input element with the name of animal1 and ID of animal1. But since I labeled the name animal without the -1, it actually doesn't know where to find that animal1 tag. So it returns null. So you got to make sure you actually wrote the name attribute properly. So you can use this kind of method and process to debug your code. Just in case something comes out null, you can go ahead and hover over it and make sure that you actually typed in the right value for the name attribute. Okay, it's looking good. Let's move on to step 6. For step 6, we're going to be adding more labels and inputs, so we should add some more spacing. So below our input element, we're going to add a line break. So right under here, let's add a little break. So that way we'll actually have the button below our animal input tag. Okay, go ahead and save this. Okay, and just like we did in step 5, you can go ahead and try again to type in some information inside our input field and submit the actual form to see what's being rendered or not. Feel free to mess around with it and see what other ones are actually being rendered. Okay, let's move on to step 7 now. So our story has quite a few blanks. We're going to need a lot more labels and inputs. So we're going to add another label with a for attribute of animal2 that renders another animal to the web page. So I'm going to make a little new line here. Let's add a new label. Make sure you add the closing tag. Let's add the text to be rendered will be another animal. And inside it, we're going to specify that this label is for animal2. Okay, looking good. I'm going to go ahead and make a little more space for us to see what we're actually typing in here. So right under a label, we're going to add another input element. And our input element will be quite similar to the input element that we created for animal1. We're going to add in an ID, a name, a type, and we're going to make sure it's also required. So let's go ahead and start by adding our input element. Let's specify the ID to be animal2. Let's make the name value to also be animal2. Let's make sure that the type is text and it's also required. Okay, and lastly, we're going to add another break just so that the button's all the way at the bottom and they're in their serpent lines. Go ahead and save that and make sure it's being rendered. Okay, looking good, and feel free to test it again. I'm going to type in tiger and lion. So you'll see that the lion one, which has the ID of animal2, is being rendered correctly in all of the places where it's looking for animal2. So you'll see that the null one is looking for an actual input that has an ID of answer. There's another one that has an input of adjective1 or adj1, and so on and so forth. So you can get an idea of what kind of form we're actually going to be creating after we finish creating everything else. Okay, let's go on to step 8 now. So there's another animal in our story, and we're going to add another label with the for attribute for animal3 that renders one more animal to the web page. We're going to add another input element that is almost identical to the previous one with an ID and name set to animal3, type text, and it's also required. So let's go ahead and do that as well. Let's type in a label, make sure it's a closing tag as well. The text being rendered is going to be one more animal. And we're going to use this label for animal3. Animal3, there we go. Okay, below our label, we're going to add in an input. We're going to have an ID of animal3. We're also going to have the name of animal 3. Let's make sure the type is equal to text, and we also have it required. Perfect. And lastly, let's not forget the break as well. Okay, save that as well, and make sure the form is being rendered correctly. Okay, this is looking good. Feel free to test out the form as you go. I'm going to do a couple of more inputs and then test it out to see if we have to debug or not. Okay, for step number 9, we're going to add users. We're going to have our users provide an adjective. So let's add one more label with the for attribute for adjective 1. Label. This will be for adjective 1. And this will render adjective. Make sure you pass in past tense. Past tense. And your colon as well. Okay, below our label, let's add our input element. Our input will have an ID and name set to adjective 1. Name will be equal to adjective 1 as well. Let's type in the text as the type as text, and let's also have it be required and save that as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and make sure that the required is working. You see that this is also going to be applied to all the other ones. And I'm just going to type in gibberish. So you see that the required boolean is actually working for all the input elements. Let's not forget a break as well, so that we actually have it nice and organized. And our form is looking good. It's taking a more elaborate look. Okay, let's move on to step number 10. Okay, for step 10, we're going to add in, let me scroll all the way to the bottom here. I'm actually going to expand this so we can have it a little bit nicer to, a little bit more organized and easier to look at. Okay, so after our adjective, we're going to add a new label. We're going to set it to, the for attribute will be equal to verb 1. So this will be for the verb that our users will be submitting. So closing and opening tag. Set it equal to verb 1 and have it display verb ends in ing. And I'm just going to grab this and copy paste it here. Let's go ahead and save that. Let's also add in an input with the following elements. So this is going to be basically the same as the previous ones that we've been creating. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste this and simply change in the actual input values here. I'm getting an error here because I'm already using an ID with the same name, and as we all know, IDs are unique values, so this cannot be the same one as a previous element, which is fine because we're going to be changing these. So let's go ahead and change in the ID to verb 1. We'll do the same for the name, and we'll leave the rest the same. Let's add the break. Make sure you save that, and let's see it being rendered right here. And there we go. We have our verb being submitted. Okay, we're going to work with other inputs now, so let's go on to step 11. Okay, so now we have some inputs set up that accept text, but we can use some input elements with different types in our form. So we're going to add a field that will accept a number. So first thing we're going to do is add in a new label with a for attribute of number 1, and that will render number to the web page. So let's go ahead and do that. Once again, I'm going to expand my text editor so you can guys see everything a little clearer. Let's go below our verb label here, create a new label. We'll set the for attribute equal to num1. Okay, and we'll add a new input element. Inside this input element, we're going to add the ID of num1 for both the name as well, num1. The only thing that's going to change is going to be the type of this input element. So remember, we can actually have several different types for input elements. In this case, we're going to specify that we're going to be putting in a number, and let's go ahead and make sure that it's also required. Save that again. Make sure it's rendering properly inside your form. You can see here that it's being giving us an option for the number, and I forgot to actually type in the label here. So make sure you add that so we know exactly what we're doing. And let's do the line break as well. Okay, looking good. So now we can know we're specifying a number here, and that's what we submitted as a type number. Let's move on to step 12. So one of the blanks requires a yes or no answer, and this sounds like we can use some radio buttons for that. So radio buttons are normally presented in groups as a collection of radio buttons describing a set of related options, and only one radio button in a group can be selected at a time. So we're going to be putting in basically a yes or no as each one of the groups. So let's expand this once again. Scroll back to step 12. Okay, so right under our number, we're going to add in a new label here. Sorry, we're going to add a span actually. So spans also have a closing, opening, and closing tag. So let's make sure you add both. And inside the span, we're going to type in yes or no. Let's go ahead and save that. Bring out your browser and see what it looks like. Okay, let's move on to step 13. For radio buttons, we're going to add the input before the label to render the radio button on the left of the text. Okay, so let's start out by adding the input element for yes. So right under our span, let's create an opening and closing tab, self-closing tag of input. Inside there, we're going to set the ID equal to yes. The type will be radio. We'll set the name to be answer. We'll have it give the value of yes. And let's also set a required attribute to be provided for the input. Make sure it renders. Okay, and you can see our little radio button right over here containing the information from that input element. Now we want to actually add a label. If we add it before, it will be on the other side. So let's add it after the input element. Let's add a label that will be rendering the text yes. Save that. Make sure it renders properly. Looking good. And make sure you add also the for attribute to be equal to yes. Okay, good. Now we can move on to the no option. So now we're going to add a radio button that represents a no choice. We're going to add another input element that has the following attributes. And then below that, we're going to add a label that has a for attribute assigned to the value of no and renders the text no on the web page. And right after that, we're going to do a break. So let's go ahead and create a new input. Once again, I'm going to expand this just so we can see clearly what we're doing. Let's go all the way to 14. Okay, right under our input for the yes button, let's go ahead and create a new one. This will have the ID of no. We'll set the type equal to radio as well. We'll have the name be also answer. The value will be no, so that will be the actual value of the radio button. And we'll set the required boolean to be true. Lastly, let's add a label as well. The label will be for the no, and the label will render simply no on it. So let's go ahead and save that. Bring out your page, and you can see that we both have a yes or no radio choice. And let's also add a break before our button submission, so we have it all the way at the bottom. Okay, it's looking good. And just in case you were wondering, if we put the label before our input, that would just put in the text on the left side. That's why we actually put it on the right. Just makes a little more sense, and people don't get confused as to which one is which for the button. Okay, it's looking good, guys. Let's move on to step 15. Now, the story that we're creating in this form involves some sort of speed. So let's give our users a drop-down list of speed options. Now we're going to create a label and set the for attribute to speed, and the label should render that text. And then below that, we're going to add a select element with an ID and name of speed, and the required attribute to make the field mandatory. So we'll add a break after closing the select tag as well. Okay. So this will be a little different because we're going to be using a drop-down menu in this case, and that drop-down menu will be displaying certain options for our users to select. So let's go ahead and go all the way down after our yes or no radio button submission. Let's start out by creating a label right after our break here. So let's create our label. I'm going to have this text being rendered, so I'm just going to grab it and copy paste it. And let's close our label tag as well. Below our label tag, this is where we're going to actually add our select tag. The select element is simply used to create a drop-down list, and inside that select element, we're going to insert option tags inside it to define the available options in the list. So let's start out by creating our select opening and closing element, and I'm going to create them in new lines because we're going to be inserting options within those tags. Let's also make sure we have an ID and a name for the select tag. We're going to have it called speed for both, and make sure it's required as well. Lastly, let's add a break after our select option. And right now, our select option should be empty because we haven't added any options, but it should be able to be rendered here. So you can see we have our drop-down menu here. Relative speed ends in ER, but we have nothing written on it because there are no options inside it. We're going to be adding some options in the following step. So let's go on to step 16. And in here, we're going to be we can see the format of how the option tag will be written. So let's press enter right of our opening tag for select, and let's add in an option here. Remember, it's opening and it needs a closing tag as well. Now this will have the value attribute. The value attribute will be essentially the actual information that will be sent with a form once it's submitted. So this will be the text that will be rendered. So we'll take this example that we have in step 16 here. The text that will be rendered will be faster, and the value that we actually want to submit will be faster. So let's do maybe two more that are similar to this. Since we have to have speeds that end in ER, I'll do one that says quicker and make sure that the value is quicker. And let's do one called speedier. Speedier. Okay, let's save that and open up your the actual page, and let's see if it is actually being rendered in our drop-down menu. And then you can see here we have faster, quicker, and speedier. And if we submit that, the actual value that will be sent with our form is the value that's found in the actual tag itself. Okay, perfect. Let's move on to step 17. So one of our stories blank require a quote. We could provide our users with a few options, but also give them the choice of adding their own custom quote. So in order to do this, we're going to use a data list element. So the data list element is kind of similar to the select drop-down menu. The only difference here is that in our drop-down menu, we only have the provided options to select, whereas the data list element, you actually have free entry by the user to type in whatever you'd like. So it has autocomplete options when we actually start typing stuff, and we can select certain things from that drop-down menu, but we can also actually type in our own value and send that over. So to set up the data list, we need to accompany a label and an input element. So under the last breakpoint that we added, we're going to add a label with a for attribute. Let's go ahead and once again make this a little nicer to read. Okay, here we go. Right under our last breakpoint, we're going to add another label here. So let's make sure, whoop, there we go, label. We're going to make sure this label is for our quote. For quote. And we want this to display motivational quote. Okay. Below our label, we're going to add our input element. It is going to have an ID assigned to quote. Name will be quote as well. The type will be equal to text. Let's make sure it has a list attribute, which will be the actual drop-down menu of options that we're going to be passing in through. We'll call that quote choices. And let's make sure it's also required. Okay, go ahead and save that. And it should be empty at the moment, but you should be able to actually type in information there. So you can see that there's no auto-completion options, but you can still type in as it was a regular text input here. Okay, let's move on to step 18. For step 18, we're going to add stuff to our data list under the input element. So we're going to assign the data list an ID of quote choices. So let's create our data list tag right after our input here. We're going to create a data list to make sure it has an ID of quote choices. Choices. Let's close it as well. And let's also add our break right after that. Okay, our button is all the way at the bottom, and we have our input here. And this will be basically our data list that has nothing inside it at the moment. Okay, for step 19, we're going to add a few options with values within the data list elements. So very similar to the options we have for our select tags, we're going to have something quite similar for our data list. Okay, so make sure you're nesting it inside your data list tag. Let's add a few options here, and these can be whatever you like. I'm going to type in value, say Code Academy. Make sure you close this. Let's add another option. Value equal code. These are ambiguous, arbitrary. You can pick whatever you like. Example. Okay, go ahead and save that. And now you can see we have our options for auto-completing our input element here, but we can also still change it and type in whatever we'd like. So perfect. We have options for some motivational quotes here that we can select, and we also have the freedom to actually type in our own personal quote. Okay, perfect. We're almost done here, guys. So for step 20, we know that every good story has a key takeaway. So we're going to finish off this form by having our users provide this message. So let's add a label that has a for attribute of message. We'll do that after our data list here. Let's make sure we have a label. We'll set it for message. Make sure it's closing as well. Inside here, we want it to actually render meaningful message. Right below our label, we're going to add in something different. We're going to add in a text area. So let's opening text area tag. Let's make sure it's closed as well. Inside our text area, we're going to add an ID and name of message. Name as message as well. And we actually want to specify the rows and columns. We can do that by simply specifying two attributes. Rows to indicate how many rows we're going to be taking over. For our case, we'll have 8 rows. And for columns, we'll type in the attribute calls. And make sure you're wrapping in these values in quotations. They're not exactly integers. Make sure they're being wrapped in quotation marks. Let's go ahead and save that. And I didn't add the break, but it should be right here. So you can see our text area is being actually displayed properly. Let me just do some adjustments. Let's add a colon to our text area. And let's also add in a break so that we have our input all the way at the bottom. There we go. Okay, perfect. It is looking good. So let's go ahead and actually test this out. Let's type in an animal, tiger, a lion. Let's type in another animal. Let's do a dog. Adjective. And for adjectives in past tense, basically adjectives ending with ed. I'll do alarmed. Verbs, running. Number, let's do a number 2. Let's type in yes. Relative, let's do quicker. Motivational quote, I'll just type in example. And meaningful message, this is a meaningful message. Let's form our story and make sure that we have no null values in here. And looks like everything was rendered correctly. So once we submitted the form, our JavaScript file was successfully able to find what the values are for all these input values and render them on a page where the placeholders were at. So if you see anything that's null, make sure you hover over it and see what ID is being referred to as null, and make sure that the name of it is being properly has a proper value and there's no spelling mistakes on it, and just go ahead and start over and try it again. Okay, looking good. And for step 21, this is basically some extra things you can do to form a story. You want to challenge yourself, you can add pre-selected values for each input field. You can add placeholder text that contains examples for users. You can add some text in here for a text area to be filled out. You can also add some extra validations like minimum length or patterns to the elements that users accept. There's a lot of stuff you can use with form. We kind of dabbled through a lot of different things you can actually do with forms and different types of inputs. So we successfully navigated and skimmed through different types tags that we actually used here. So forms are very versatile and they're very useful. And when you work with backend data stuff as well, you're going to be working with a lot of forms. So whenever you create a user or whenever you submit a post in a website or place an order, these are all being used through forms. So all the information that's being grabbed through forms is being sent to to backend information or servers and actually using those values. So you'll be seeing a lot of forms if you actually end up working in positions like backend stuff or even front end a lot because you're actually going to be creating these forms as well. And you'll be in charge of styling, making sure the form looks nice. Sometimes you want maybe a different style of form where it's a little more wide and you have to split it into different div containers. So as opposed to the backend where it mostly works with behind the scene using the values from the form, the front end position will mostly take care of how it's displayed, what are the actual values when you actually write something in the input, what are the contents within drop-down menus or data list containers, the size of your text area, the format and look and styling of your button when you're submitting the form. So mostly how the user or client actually sees the form itself when it's displayed on the website. So that concludes our project for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see everyone next time.